John Henry George Lee was born in August 1864 in the village of Babbacombe, Devon. After leaving school, like many others who came from poorer backgrounds, the teenager found work as a footman's servant for Emma Keyse, a single woman around 68 years old, who lived at the Glen in Babbacombe, a quiet seaside village near Torquay. Miss Emma Ann Whitehead Keyse was known locally as a respectable and fairly private resident, maintaining a comfortable household supported by domestic staff. Living with her were 3 servants, sisters Jane and Eliza, who worked as maidservants, and Elizabeth Harris, who was employed as a cook. This arrangement was typical of a modest Victorian household of her standing, where a small team of servants managed daily duties such as cooking, cleaning and general upkeep. Lee's work would likely have involved running errands, assisting with meals and general domestic work. There's very little factually known what went on in the household in those early days, but it's been said Emma Keyse was a fair woman and ran her household with a reasonable amount of discipline, although these facts change slightly depending on the source, so it's difficult to know for sure. A few years later, when he was around 16 or 17 years old, at a guess, as these were the enlistment ages at the time, he joined the Royal Navy at Devonport in Plymouth. As for his reasoning for leaving domestic service, it was said it was because of some sort of unreliability, though these details on this are not clear and differ depending on source. After 3 years in the Navy, he was discharged due to health reasons. After his brief and unsuccessful spell in the Royal Navy, John Henry George Lee drifted back into the only work he really knew, domestic service. In the seaside town of Torquay, he found employment once again, this time in the household of Colonel Brownlow at Ridge Hill. It was a respectable position on the surface, the kind that offered a stability to a young man with few prospects. But beneath that appearance, the pattern of Lee's early life, restless, unsettled, and apparently unreliable, had not changed. Servants were expected to be invisible, obedient, and above suspicion. Trust was everything in a household where valuables were kept within easy reach of those who worked behind the scenes. And for a time, Lee carried out his duties as required, moving quietly through the routines of service. But that trust would not last. And in 1883, it was discovered that silverware, valued at around £20, a significant sum at the time, had gone missing from the house. Suspicion quickly fell on Lee. Faced with the evidence, he didn't contest the charge. He pleaded guilty. The case was dealt with swiftly, as such matters often were. There was little leniency for a servant who had betrayed his employer's trust. Lee was sentenced to 6 months' hard labour at Exeter Prison. For a young man already struggling to find his place, the conviction marked a turning point. It was no longer just a matter of poor prospects or failed employment. He now carried the stain of a criminal record. When John Henry George Lee walked out of Exeter Prison in 1884, he did so with more than just his freedom restored. He carried with him the mark of a convicted servant, something that in Victorian England would quietly close doors before they even opened them. Work would not come easily now, but remarkably, one door did open again. In Babbacombe at the Glen, Emma Keyse made a decision to take on a man she had known before, when he was just a boy, fresh from leaving school. For whatever reason, perhaps charity, Lee returned to the Glen. Inside the house, the routines of domestic service resumed much as before. But this time there was something different. Lee was no longer an unknown youth. He was a man with a past. His half-sister, Elizabeth Harris, worked in the kitchen as the cook and might have influenced his re-employment. For Miss Keyse, it probably felt like an act of kindness, giving a young man who had made early mistakes a second chance. But was this decision a mistake? One that would soon draw national attention and place John Lee once again at the centre of suspicion. By late 1884, a quiet uncertainty had begun to settle over the Glen. The household staff, long accustomed to routine, now found themselves wondering what lay ahead. Their employer, Emma Keyse, had recently agreed to sell the property for the considerable sum of £13,000, a figure that reflected its enviable position. With the sale in motion, she had begun the careful process of winding up her affairs. These decisions were already being felt within the household. Among them was a reduction in wages, especially for John Lee. On Friday the 14th, 1884, Miss Keyse was reportedly unwell. After breakfast she withdrew to her bedroom and remained there for most of the day. It was only in the early evening, at around 5 o'clock, that she briefly came downstairs, before retiring once again. Elsewhere, the cook, Elizabeth Harris, was said to be feeling unwell due to the early stages of pregnancy. Once her duties were complete, she too retired to bed. The two elderly maids, Eliza and Jane Neck, continued their duties. That night the household gathered as usual, and at 11 o'clock prayers were said, an established ritual that brought staff and mistress together before the close of the day. All were present. There was nothing, at least on the surface, to suggest that anything was amiss. Afterwards the house settled. The staff withdrew to their rooms. Lee went to his bed in the pantry, a small space off the main part of the house. Miss Keyse remained downstairs and is believed to have remained in the dining room after prayers. In the early hours of the 15th of November 1884, Elizabeth Harris was awakened by the smell of smoke. Realizing something was wrong, she roused the two elderly maids, Eliza and Jane, and the three women made their way from their rooms into a house already filling with smoke. As they moved through the hallway towards the dining room, they became aware of separate fires burning within the house, an observation later noted in their statements. All three would also speak of a strong smell of paraffin, far more than would be expected from an ordinary domestic fire. During this time they encountered John Lee. He was partially dressed and had a visible injury to his arm. When questioned, he said he had cut himself while breaking a window in an attempt to let smoke escape. The household then made efforts to deal with the flames as best they could. It was in the course of this confusion that the body of Emma Keyse was discovered inside the house. She was found lying on the floor in the dining room, her body showing clear signs of a violent injury as well as burning. The condition in which she was found, together with the presence of multiple small fires and the strong smell of paraffin, would later form a central part of the case presented to the court. What had begun as the smell of smoke in the early morning hours had within minutes revealed itself to be something far more deliberate and far more troubling. Lee ran and raised the alarm at the local pub and with the fishermen. Medical evidence presented by Thomas Stevenson showed that Miss Keyse had suffered severe head injuries and a cut throat, indicating that she had been violently attacked before the fire began. Evidence at the scene suggested that paraffin had been used to accelerate the flames, with combustible materials placed to encourage burning, pointing to an attempt to destroy evidence. Miss Keyse was found downstairs in the house, and while the precise sequence of events remains unknown, it is believed the fatal attack occurred there sometime during the night. Evidence within the house suggested that the violence and subsequent fire were not confined to a single location. Blood staining and burnt materials, including papers, were found in more than one area, indicating activity beyond the room where Miss Keyse's body was ultimately discovered. While this raised the possibility that her body may have been moved after the attack, this could not be established with certainty and remained a matter of interpretation rather than a proven fact. In the aftermath of the fire at the Glen, suspicion increasingly centred on John Lee, not because of the single decisive piece of evidence, but through a pattern of details that investigators believed pointed in his direction. Attention was drawn to his clothing. Witnesses described his shirt as marked with staining, and there were claims that it carried a smell consistent with oil, significant in a case where paraffin had been used to fuel the fire that followed the death of Emma Keyse. At the time, such observations were compelling, though they relied heavily on interpretation rather than the kind of precise forensic analysis that we have around today. The presence of paraffin was central to the investigation. It was widely believed that an accelerant had been used to ignite the fire, and an oil container was known to be kept within the house, not far from where Lee slept. To the prosecution, this suggested opportunity, ready access to the very substance used to conceal the crime. Yet none of these elements stood alone as proof. There was no direct evidence placing Lee at the moment of the murder. But suspicion had settled on John Lee, who was believed to have been the only man in the house that night. They had little else to go on, and attention quickly turned to motive. It was suggested that tension had existed between Lee and his employer. This was based on an earlier incident in which Lee had been caught attempting to sell an item from the household and was subsequently subjected to a reduction in wages rather than dismissal. The Crown argued that this may have created the resentment. However, no motive was ever proven. At the time of her death, Emma Keyse had agreed to sell the Glen and had begun putting her affairs in order. While this created a sense of uncertainty within the household, there's no evidence that the sale itself formed part of the motive alleged against John Lee. Instead, the prosecution focused on more immediate tensions between the employer and the servant regarding his reduction in wages. Beneath it all, one fact remained. The case was entirely circumstantial. However, when pressed, Lee was unable to give a clear or consistent explanation of his movements during the time in which the murder of Emma Keyse had occurred. Just 2 days after the killing at St Mary Church Town Hall, an inquest was convened before a local jury. The room filled with witnesses and officials, and one by one testimonies were heard, 25 in total. Among those called were the household staff, the cook, Elizabeth Harris, and 2 maids from the Glen, the elderly sisters Eliza and Jane Neck. Their statements helped establish the routines of the house, the movements within it, and the atmosphere in the days leading up to the crime. By the close of the inquest, the jury had reached its conclusion. There was, they believed, sufficient cause to proceed. Lee was committed for trial at the Exeter Assizes. The trial of John Henry George Lee opened at Exeter Assizes in February 1885. He was initially associated with solicitor Reginald Gwynne Templar, whose involvement would later attract some comment. The exact nature of Templar's connection to the household of Emma Keyse and how he became involved in Lee's defence remains unclear. Some later accounts have suggested a closer association, but these claims are not firmly supported by contemporary evidence. A few days before the trial, Reginald fell ill, seriously ill, and was replaced by his younger brother Charles Gwynne Templar, assisted by John St Auburn. Reginald never fully recovered and died on the 18th of December 1886 from what was then described as paralysis of the insane, which was a Victorian term often linked to advanced syphilis. On his deathbed it was claimed he was rambling about murder, but this is also debatable. It was later speculated that solicitor Reginald Templar may have had a personal connection to the household, including suggestions of a relationship with the cook Elizabeth Harris, who was pregnant at the time. However, no contemporary evidence supports these claims. Templar was never treated as a suspect, and there is nothing in the original investigation or trial to indicate his involvement in the murder. Such theories remain speculative and emerge only in later interpretations of the case. Lee maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but his defence was weak. No witnesses were called on his behalf, and the cross-examination of prosecution witnesses was short and not much help. The prosecution's case wasn't much better. It relied mainly on the idea that Lee, a young man with a prior conviction, was the only male in the house at the time of the murder and was later found with blood on his clothes, that Lee claimed came from the cut on his arm when he broke the windows to let out the smoke. It was also claimed that his coat and trousers smelt of paraffin oil. However, the medical testimony raised doubts about this, particularly regarding the clothing. Medical witness Herbert Nicholas Chilcott told the court that while John Lee's coat smelt strongly of paraffin, he did not initially notice a similar smell on the trousers when they were first brought to him. He only detected it later. This introduced a degree of uncertainty into the evidence, though no conclusion was reached as to why this was. Although the case against Lee was almost entirely circumstantial, the jury took just 40 minutes to return a guilty verdict, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. When the judge asked why he had accepted the sentence so calmly, Lee replied, "The reason I am so calm is that I trust in the Lord, and he knows that I am innocent." John Lee's execution was set to take place at Exeter Prison on the 23rd of February 1885. It's claimed that just before his scheduled execution, John Henry George Lee wrote to his half-sister Elizabeth Harris. In the letter, it's claimed, he maintained his innocence and accused the household servants of giving false evidence against him, writing that the truth would one day come out. In some recorded versions of the letter, he expressed bitterness towards those who had testified, suggesting they had not told the truth. The scaffolding test, and this is important for obvious reasons. At Exeter Prison, preparations for the execution followed what officials described as standard procedure. The scaffold had only recently been moved from its original position in an old prison hospital and rebuilt inside the building known as the Van House. This would be the first execution carried out in that new location. The man responsible for carrying out the sentence was James Berry, an experienced hangman. As was customary, he tested the mechanism beforehand, following the standard Victorian procedure for testing a gallows. Before an execution, the drop was tested with a weighted sack, usually filled to match the prisoner's body weight. The idea was to simulate the force of the fall and make sure the trapdoor opened cleanly, the hinges and mechanism worked smoothly. The rope length, the drop, was correctly calculated. According to the prison governor, Edwin Cowton, all the usual checks were completed multiple times on February the 21st, and everything appeared to be in proper working order. On paper, nothing seemed out of place. Berry had already tested the scaffold and simply waited out of sight in the prison for the appointed time of 8 a.m. on the 23rd of February to carry out the sentence. After the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868 was passed, all executions were no longer carried out in public, but had to take place inside prison. Only those directly involved, such as the officials responsible for carrying out the execution and the prison chaplain, were permitted to attend, along with a small number of authorised members of the press. On the morning of the execution at Exeter Prison, John Lee was pinioned, brought from his cell and led to the scaffold in accordance with standard prison procedure. He was accompanied by the officials, including the executioner James Berry, as well as the prison staff and the chaplain. Accounts describe the walk as calm and orderly. Lee is said to have remained composed as he was guided into position onto the trapdoor. Berry then carried out his duties in the usual way, placing the noose and preparing to release the mechanism. Gerald de Courcy Hamilton, the Chief Constable of Devon, gave one of the official eyewitness accounts of the attempted execution of Lee at Exeter Prison. He confirmed that everything appeared to proceed normally at first. Lee was brought onto the scaffold, the noose was placed around his neck, and the executioner pulled the lever, but the trapdoor failed to open. Hamilton stated that the mechanism was checked and reset, and the process was repeated, yet the trap still did not fall. This happened a third time, with the same result. Crucially, he also noticed that when the apparatus was tested again, without Lee standing on it, the trapdoor worked perfectly. His account supports the central mystery of the case that the gallows functioned as expected in testing, but repeatedly failed at the exact moment it was meant to carry out the execution. To quote the Chief Constable's eyewitness statement, on the prisoner reaching the place of execution, he was placed by Berry, the executioner, immediately under the crossbeam, over which was carried the rope. He was faced outwards towards the door, with both feet standing transversely on the junction of the two flaps, or shutters, which formed the drop. The executioner, with considerable skill and rapidity, as it appeared to me, strapped the culprit's legs above the ankles, drew the cap over his face, adjusted the noose around his neck, stepped back and pulled the iron handle or trigger to let fall the footboard. To my intense astonishment, however, these latter deflected only about the quarter of an inch and appeared to be tightly jammed together about the centre. The executioner and some of the prison officials standing by endeavoured by stamping on the boards to get them to move, but without avail. After some seconds, the prisoner's face was uncovered and he was led away to an adjoining cell or room in the prison. End quote. After the flaps failed to open for the third time, Lee reportedly said after the third failed attempt, "See, you can't hang me," before he was led away. The officials held a heated discussion to try again, but it was considered unacceptable to keep repeating it, and in the end they decided to abandon the execution and sent Lee back to his cell. The prison medical officer then continued the story. To quote, that this third attempt having failed, I ordered him to be removed to a cell near myself, attempting to take him into my reception ward through which he had previously passed. That I am reported to have said to the prison officials, "You may experiment as much as you like on a sack of flour, but you shall not experiment on this man any longer." That he was accordingly taken into a passage near. That presently the governor informed the chaplain and myself that the apparatus would not work. That I then desired that the man should be taken back and the execution postponed. That the said condemned prisoner was returned to his cell. That I offered the under-sheriff a certificate, which he was glad to accept. The morning after the failed execution, the scaffold stood ready, its mechanism now the subject of intense scrutiny. 2 clerks of works were called in to carry out a detailed inspection. At first there had been a simple explanation, that the trap had jammed under pressure, perhaps caused by swelling in the wood or strain at the centre. But as the examination began, that theory quickly began to unravel. Piece by piece the apparatus was checked. What the inspectors found told a different story. According to the official report into the failure, the problem did not lie in the weight of the condemned man, nor in any natural distortion of the structure. Instead, their findings pointed to human error. It was something so small but critical. The scaffold, it seemed, had not been correctly reassembled after it was moved to the van house. Closer inspection revealed the flaw. The end of one of the long hinges was resting just slightly too far onto the draw bolt mechanism, by no more than 1/8 of an inch. A discrepancy so small it could easily go unnoticed, yet significant enough to alter the entire operation. To understand its effect, the clerks tested the mechanism themselves. With no weight on the platform, they pulled the lever. When operated quickly, the trap functioned as expected. The platform dropped cleanly, but when the lever was pulled slowly, the actions changed. At times, the trap refused to release altogether. At others, it fell unevenly, catching momentarily, the movement accompanied by the telltale resistance of friction at the hinge. It was inconsistent, unreliable, and in an execution there could be no margin for uncertainty. The conclusion was precise. The slight misalignment had caused the failure. The hinge resting too far onto the drawer bolt prevented a smooth release of the mechanism. The inspectors suggested that during reassembly, the two halves of the scaffold may have been set just a fraction too close together, or that the hinge itself had been subtly bent during its relocation. A minor fault, a technical oversight, yet it was enough to halt the machinery of execution 3 times, and in doing so, changed the course of a man's fate. Sir William Harcourt, the then Home Secretary, heard of the circumstances of Lee's failed execution. Lee was not immediately freed. The Home Secretary decided to commute his death sentence to life imprisonment. The case quickly captured national attention. Newspapers across Britain reported the events in detail, turning John Henry George Lee into a figure of public fascination. As the story spread, many began to question whether he had been wrongfully convicted, given the largely circumstantial evidence against him. It was during this wave of intense press coverage that he became widely known as the man they could not hang, a name that ensured the case would endure in public memory long after the events themselves. After his sentence was commuted, John Lee began a term of penal servitude at Portland Prison, where he was subjected to hard labour. He was later transferred to Dartmoor Prison and subsequently to Parkhurst Prison, where he remained until his release in 1907. Accounts of his time in prison suggested he adapted to the regime of long-term incarceration, although detailed records of his daily life remain limited. Lee was released in 1907 and returned to his mother's home, where he tried to rebuild his life. In 1909, he married Jessie Augusta Bullard and started a family, having a boy and a girl, but the relationship did not last. Around 1911, Lee left England for America with another woman, leaving Jessie and the children to fend for herself. It's thought she struggled over the years and had no further contact with John Lee. It's believed she and the children battled through poverty, and she managed to survive until her death in 1960. While in America, John Babbacombe Lee told his story in a memoir, The Man They Could Not Hang, published in 1912. It cemented his place in history as a man who survived the gallows. He lived quietly in the United States for the rest of his life, dying in Milwaukee on the 19th of March 1945 at the age of 80. Thank you for watching, or even just listening.